Humanoids, welcome. Lecture 20. I'm so excited. It's a new module. Climate policies. What are the options? In this lecture, we are going to step way back and try to get a big picture sense of what are the climate policies that we possibly could and maybe should be putting into place. And I'm going to have you think about this through this imaginary exercise of being a climate czar. More on that in a second. So our objectives today are really to get us thinking about the overall objectives of this module, which is thinking about policy alternatives. So we've thought a lot about climate change. We've theorized the political landscape, but now we're going to start getting into the specifics of, well, what can we do, what has been done, what should be done from a policy perspective about climate change. In this lecture, you're going to be appointed a climate czar, climate queen, climate king, I don't know. The climate leader of the world. What would you do? Okay, that's really the question I want you thinking about. Well, I think what you would do is you have to figure out the problem, survey the possibilities, and pick the best one. That's what we're going to think through today. Then, of course, a note that there is no such thing as a global climate czar. So we're going to end on the reality of our climate political landscape as it is, which is a way to segue into the rest of this module, which will be talks more specifically on what practically is being done and can be done, and what are the debates around these policies. Okay, so congrats, you're the global climate czar. It comes with the crown. Those of you who don't know who this is, I just feel sorry for you. You'll have to look it up or ask me. But certainly a royalty in some regard. Okay, note for this exercise, you're not the climate fairy, okay? You don't have a magic wand. You can't just wish away emissions or make carbon dioxide somehow not contribute to the greenhouse effect, or just make everybody love simplicity. Everybody becomes a Thoreau monk-like person and they don't consume anything. We're not doing that. What I'm just saying, you still have to contend with physical, material, technological reality. But imagine you have total political power to make whatever decisions you thought were best about the climate. That's the situation I'm putting you into. So yeah, so what would you do? Now, Akbar has a cautionary tale. Hold on. Akbar, get back to your cautionary tale. Okay. Beware of unintended consequences. Okay, so you have absolute power. Doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to make a wise decision. You can create new problems or even make the existing problem of climate change worse. For example, in many ways, policy is a cautionary tale of just this kind of problem, right? One example. Road space rationing in Mexico City. The story goes that in order to address smog, like you see in this picture, air pollution, they implemented a policy of only allowing certain vehicles on the road on certain days of the week. And the way they determined which vehicles would be on the road was by the last digit in their license plate. So odd digit license plates could be on, I don't know, Monday, Wednesday, and even could be Tuesday, Thursday, or, something like this, right? I don't remember the details. And actually for a while this worked because they did limit the number of cars on the road, which limited the smog, and so air quality improved. But as they implemented this as a permanent policy, you know what people did? They went out and bought a second vehicle. And then they put the opposite numbered license plate on that vehicle. So regardless of what day it was of the week, they could drive one of their vehicles around the city. Worse than that, though, the vehicle they bought was a kind of clunker. It was a cheap one and usually more polluting. And after a while, because of this reaction to the policy, you actually saw a smog increase. That is to say that the air quality decreased. And so you had this backlash or this unintended consequence result. So be wary of that, right? When you're the climate czar, what's really going to work? I mean, that's the question. Okay, Policy, what is it? This is a module on policy. We've talked a bit about this before. For now, let's at least think of policy as a commitment to a course of action that's taken by a government or a business or any kind of organization. For example, China, as I'm recording this, just recently announced a commitment to being net zero carbon emissions by 2060. Now, at this point, I think policy is kind of a fuzzy word. You could say that's kind of an aspiration. I'm not sure they've actually fleshed out how they're going to get there. And depending on your definition, you might want to say a policy has to have all those details in it. But I guess I'll call that a policy. That's a commitment to a course of action, right? Or Microsoft has committed to being net zero with their carbon, in fact, to be negative emissions by a certain date, okay? Just as a couple of examples of policies. Or to keep it simple, so if it's a set of guidelines or rules that determines a course of action, think about a store's return policy. Like, so you got a piece of clothing that doesn't fit. There's going to be a policy in place governing what happens in that situation. That's kind of what we mean by policy. I don't want to make it anything too mysterious. It's kind of intuitive. Is these guidelines or rules that will determine what's going to happen. And so what I'm saying, you being the climate czar, you can still have, remember our decision process here, you can still have wise, learned advisors providing intelligence and amongst themselves promoting what they think are the best policies for you to enact. But you're the decider, okay? You're in that prescription stage there, that prescription function. You decide. This is Akbar knows, a bugaboo of mine, leaf blowers. What's the deal with leaf blowers? I mean, they're loud, they're polluting, they're smelly, they're ineffectual, I think. So maybe if I was climate czar, one of my pronouncements would be no more leaf blowers, okay? And no matter what I say, down that chain of the decision process, invocation, so there would be, you know, like the police basically would invoke that and enforce that, and the courts would have to uphold it, right? So that's a situation we're in, and I'm asking you what you would do. Now, think about this a little bit more deeply, because in a way, to ask you to be the climate czar is really a messed up thing to do, and it wouldn't be a good thing to have. It's a lot like the philosopher king, which Socrates proposed kind of with his eyes hidden, because it's a bit of a shameful thing to do, because what you're doing is eliminating other perspectives and participants effectively, right? They don't get to count. You get to make the decision. Well, that's obviously not a democratic way of thinking about politics. It's actually very much fundamentally against the human condition insofar as we're the political animal, right? So keep that in mind. This is not a healthy thing to be imagining from an actual, like, this is the way we should do policy, but I think it's a helpful thought experiment to do. Also note, you still have to deal with the situation of where we are historically, right? And the physical reality of the greenhouse effect and all of that. So this would be magic. This would be the climate fairy. Could wish all of that away. The unlimited resources or something. You still have limited resources. You still have to deal with the situation. So we're not in the world of magic. But what we're focusing on is you get to decide what strategies you're going to implement to achieve the outcomes that we need when it comes to climate policy. Okay, so where would you start? Well, I think with those outcomes, right, you have to define the problem. I'm not going to belabor this because we've talked about the problem orientation quite a bit. But you would need to, I think, if you're the climate czar, you're thinking about climate policy, you're going to have to keep in the front of your mind, what are the goals? And as we know, there's going to be different ways to frame that, right? This plurality that we've eliminated now exists, and there's going to be differences on this. But for now, let's just say, look, the goals are to stabilize greenhouse gases in order to avoid dangerous interference in the climate system. As you'll recall, that's straight out of the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then another goal, I think, is to increase the resilience to climate disruptions, which always happen and are baked into the system from the emissions we've already put up into the atmosphere, right? So I think these are the two goals we have. The trends, we've talked a lot about this, getting worse in terms of where our emissions are still going up. Maybe it's getting better though, in terms of the wealthier we get, the more resilient we tend to get. Projections, well, you know, we've talked about this with our climate models and everything. I think we can say fairly certainly that we're in for a worse time if we keep with the status quo path that we're on now. We talked about conditioning factors. Why are we in this situation? What's causing the trends? Well, primarily fossil fuels and also land use development. And then the indirect drivers we talked about, capitalism, we've talked about this ideal of the good life as consumption. So we talked about all this stuff. This module incorporates all of that with a focus on the alternatives. Okay, so what are we gonna do? Well, what can we do? what are the options? We call the Kaya identity. So this is, again, this lecture on policy is the biggest perspective on what are kind of the buckets of options that are available for us. And then in the next lectures, we're going to kind of pick out more specific paths here. Well, the biggest sort of buckets you can imagine is if you want to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations and you want to build resiliency in the face of a disrupted climate system, you can pull the lever of population. And that doesn't mean you cull the population. I mean, I guess a climate czar could say, let's eliminate half the population, but a climate czar is not immune from political rebellion. And if you start saying we're going to eliminate people, get ready, you're gonna be eliminated. I would subject to you. But no, population could be, let's educate people, especially women. Let's provide family planning resources for people, right? Those can be really smart climate policies. We can pull the wealth lever. You could say, well, let's just lower the GDP by 11% annually. Get ready for the rebellion if that happens, right? You could say, actually, let's invest in things that make people more wealthy because that makes them more resilient in the face of climate change. The big one, right? Energy intensity and carbon intensity of the energy. Can we make policies that make more efficient economic productivity? And in particular, can we bring on board carbon neutral forms of energy, right? So those are the big levers you can pull. Another thing we've talked about is this framework coming up. But note, already you're starting to realize, even in this fanciful situation of the climate czar, there's no big knob or magic bullet. There's no one policy out there. There's gonna have to be a suite of them. And so we've talked about this too before. Mitigation, adaptation, and geoengineering. That is, where can we direct our policy interventions? The human impacts on climate with mitigation, can we reduce our emissions? Can we directly intervene in the climate system with geoengineering? And can we try to, let's say, reduce or get more resilient in the face of climate impacts on humans, and that's adaptation. So let's look at each of those a little more closely, because I think these are really important buckets. So mitigation, and again, this is a first pass. We'll come back at these as we go through the rest of the module. Things like carbon taxes, cap and trade schemes, standards like renewable portfolio standards that says you have to have X% of renewable energy on your grid by X date in the future, right? You can also just say, we're going to ban fracking, or we're going to ban the extraction of fossil fuels. Beware of unintended consequences of all of these things, right? Or you can have incentives for renewables, investments in R&D, etc., right? Geoengineering. I don't know if I'll have a chance to talk more about this, but there's really two main kinds of geoengineering. There's solar radiation management, which is basically dampen the amount of sunlight hitting the surface of the earth, which then of course would have this effect on the greenhouse effect. And then there's carbon dioxide removal. That's like the hole in the bottom of the bucket, right? The carbon bucket that's filling up. Well, there's different ways to empty that out. And you don't need to know those terms in specific unless I come back to them in the future. I'm not sure if we'll get there. Hopefully we will. And then there's adaptation. And this one's a little bit harder to find the categories within it, but basically you can think of infrastructure even from like big seawalls to keep the sea level rise from overtaking a city, to little things like, like building up what is that called? Absorbent pavement in cities, so that if you get more flooding in a certain area, you've got this surface area that's covered with something that can absorb and drain that better, right? So from big to little things you can do. Also a big one, adaptive thing, maybe the biggest thing, is reducing poverty. You might say that's the biggest thing we do from climate change is to reduce poverty and inequality. We talked about that with the eco-moderns. And then there's adaptive practices for agriculture, ecological restoration, like building up the wetlands so that in the face of increasing storm intensity, they do a better job at buffering human settlements from those disruptive events, right, etc. Okay, so you've kind of defined the problem, you've surveyed the options here. How do you pick the best ones? Well, let's assume that you're a benevolent climate czar, okay? You're seeking the good, the common interest, the common good. You have some commitment to human dignity, some commitment to sustainability, to biodiversity, right? These sort of common interest goals. Because that's important to say, because if you didn't, well, you'd have all sorts of strategies open to you, but I don't think that's the right way to be a climate czar. I think ultimately what you'd have to do to choose the best ones is a cost-benefit calculation. So what will give you the biggest bang for the buck? In other words, how do you get the most climate goods in terms of the goals we laid out earlier, A and B, for the least cost? I think that's your selection mechanism, right? So you survey the options. For all the climate policies we're going to talk about, in some way, it's a cost-benefit assessment, right? That doesn't mean it's simple, okay, because you have to think through a lot. I think these things in particular, what's going to count as a cost or a harm? So what's your accounting of that like? How do you weigh and compare different costs or harms? Whose interest do you take into account? In particular, future generations. How far into the future do you need to think, and how much do you discount those future interests? Non-humans, individuals, and systems. How much and what ways do they count? How do you handle uncertainties? That's the big one. I put that in bold. Given that these decisions you've got to make as the decider are forward-looking, and there's no way you can predict the consequences, at least not with a great level of detail. How do you handle that? So it's really a risk cost benefit calculation when you're trying to pick the best policies here. And then anytime you're doing a cost benefit assessment, you got to ask, how are we going to handle individual rights and liberties? Because it's easy to be the climate czar who's tallying up costs on one side and benefits on the other. Well, what if in your great cost benefit assessment, you come up with a decision that totally tramples over the rights and liberties of some segment of the population? And you say, well, sorry, you just have to be sacrificed for the greater good. After all, we're guided by the common good here. Those are really tough ethical, philosophical questions to confront. So define the problem, survey the options, pick the best ones. And in picking it, you got all of these trade-offs to think through and all of these nuances. What I think actually is going on, and we're going to read this later in the semester, this project drawdown, this is what they do. They do this kind of massive, big-scale cost-benefit assessment, and then they rank, here are the top like 100 climate solutions, the alternatives in our problem orientation, ranked by which one gives us the biggest bang for the buck. That is, how much do they achieve the climate objectives with how little do they actually cost, or how much do they actually save us? An example, and we'll get to more of this in the last module, bicycle infrastructure. If you were the climate czar, one of the things you should do is really push hard on bicycle infrastructure. Why? People riding on bikes don't emit carbon dioxide compared to people riding in their cars. So you can save gigatons of carbon dioxide, and you also will save money because this bicycle infrastructure is cheaper to build and cheaper to maintain in the long run. So you see, this is the cost benefit assessment. That's how a climate czar should be thinking, or at least I submit that to you. Of course, last thing, there are no climate czars. We're in the real politics here, for better and worse. Plurality. Remember, I've talked about that a lot. When we X those out, different perspectives, different participants, you can't just X those out. So we have to deal with these differences. And we have to deal with different jurisdictions, in different rules, different constitutions all around the world. We're in a situation of national sovereignty. So, there's really no effective global government that can handle this global problem. So you have to have these sort of more or less tenuous treaties like the Paris Accord, where people agree on these things of their own accord because they're all sovereign nations. You also, of course, have global corporate capitalism and all the dynamics going on there. All those decisions made in the boardrooms of these big companies and small companies, right? Plurality, right? That's the word. And then I put this America's Pledge here because it's not just in the national level, you think the federal government is the big point of influence for climate policy, but I'd like to challenge that. The federal government does a lot, but there's all these subnational actors, uh, state governments, city governments, NGOs, businesses, universities. And this America's Pledge is actually a coalition of all those subnational actors that say the US is still going to reach our Paris Climate Accord commitments, even though the federal government's pulling us out of that. And this all adds up to reality creates this Overton window. I think we've mentioned that phrase before. What I mean by that is just simply, what's the window of real possibilities? Like if politics is the art of the possible, there's going to be some things that maybe a climate czar in utopia would do, but it's just not politically, practically feasible. That's the Overton window. What's in that frame? Okay. But still, notice, not just on climate change, but any issue, that window shifts and that window can open wider. So maybe as we're thinking about climate policies, let's not just think about what has been done, what seems to be politically feasible to do, but let's think about maybe we need to open that window wider to make things that previously seemed totally fanciful, maybe a reality, right? And I think climate change is so big that we have to start opening our windows of what we can and should do, maybe. Okay, so now I think we're ready to examine the climate policy landscape in the real world, and that's what we're gonna do for the remainder of the lectures. Just had to put this one in here. Boy, if you were the climate czar, couldn't you just look at this and say, transportation sector, what's the low-hanging fruit there, right? What can I do? Batteries? Well, maybe I could just ban personal automobiles, right? What are you going to do? So you can go down the Sankey diagram and say, well, here's all the sectors. Which ones can I attack in a way that gives us the greatest bang for the buck, right? If I was a climate czar, that's kind of the way I'd look at it globally. Okay, that's enough for me. The cosmic punter, this is a really bad one, Akbar. Oh my gosh, remember wind energy is just solar power in disguise? Ooh, I don't know, we can do better. Okay, but on that rather sour note, I will bid you a fond farewell. Till next time, as always, may the force be with you.